Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell of the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Let's get started.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today we will be discussing grandparenting and how grandparents influence their grandchildren's development. Joining us today is Dr. Kurt Ela to guide us through this fascinating topic. Kurt is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. He works with patients throughout the life cycle with an emphasis on child and adolescent therapy as well as parenting and grandparenting. He has been awarded the department's Psychotherapy Supervisor of the Year Award, the Wellness Coach Recognition Award, and the William Lycomel MD Distinguished Seminar Teacher Award. Kurt received his BA from Amherst College and his doctorate from the George Washington University. He completed his internship at the University of Pennsylvania, where he worked with pediatric, adolescent, and adult patients. So, I'm excited to learn from Kurt in this episode. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sarah. It's really great to be here.
Amazing. So just to introduce us a little bit, can you tell me what compelled you to pursue psychology?
Sure. So I actually had a career in advertising prior to psychology, and I worked with a lot of different pro bono accounts. And one of them was in the city of Chicago, where there's a lot of gun violence, unfortunately. And I worked with a nonprofit organization called the Chicago Project for Violence Prevention. And so I worked with an epidemiologist named Dr. Gary Slutkin, and he and I would, with our team, try to develop messages to people to help prevent violence and then help the community heal after an act of violence. And that got me really interested in thinking about how I might be able to make a bigger difference in the world, and that led me ultimately to psychology.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that with us. So to get to know you a little bit better before we dive into our topic for today, this is our segment, Have You Met Kurt? And this is going to be a bit of a quick fire segment of just a few things about you. So first of all, do you have a favorite book?
I do. I love The Alchemist.
Oh, yeah. I actually had another guest say that one recently, so it's definitely looking like something I should check out. And secondly, do you have a movie that you've enjoyed recently?
I do. I saw the Minecraft movie with my kids, and I got a kick out of it, mainly because they really got a kick out of it.
Oh, that's really nice. Bit of family time. Right. I've heard a lot about the Minecraft movie, but I haven't yet seen it myself, so I probably will in the future. Next, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I do. I enjoy podcasts with a mental health angle, such as 10% Happier by Dan Harris, or relationships, such as Jillian on Love by Jill Turecki. Those are podcasts that I really enjoy.
Interesting. And do you have a role model? This could either be someone like in your personal life or something professional.
Sure. So I have one of each, and one role model I already mentioned, Dr. Gary Slutkin. He's the epidemiologist that looked at violence through the lens of an epidemic, and I thought that was genius. And then the other, apropos to this discussion, is my grandmother. She was a really fun-loving, creative person who saw the good in everybody, and she was a real role model for me growing up.
That's lovely. And finally, is there a class or a course that you've taken or maybe that you've taught that has inspired you?
Well, that's a good question. I do teach a number of classes, and one is called Cura Personalis, caring for the whole person. And so I teach it to medical students, and the message in it is good for, obviously, medical students, but it's good for all of us that we need to care for the whole person when we're dealing with people, not just their physical health, but also their mental health, their spiritual health. And so Cura Personalis is a class that Georgetown teaches, and I think it's great.
That's fantastic. Well, that was an amazing way to get to know you and get to know a little bit more about how we're going to tackle this topic today about the unique role of grandparents. So, first of all, we want to dive in and get a few definitions under our belt. What does grandparenting mean to you?
It's a good question. I work with a lot of grandparents as well as a lot of grandchildren, so I see it from both directions, and of course the parents in between. And grandparents are typically biologically the parents of the children's parents. Now, having said that, it gets much broader than that. It's any figure in a person's life who takes on a very specific role, that there is a familial relationship. It could be through divorce, it could be um, a lot of different areas where it doesn't have to be a biological grandparent, but often that's what we think about, the parents of the grandchildren's parents, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some of the common roles that a grandparent might take on in the family unit?
Sure, sure. So, according to experts, there's different roles that grandparents can fill, and one role would be basically no role at all. That they're distant, they're remote, or even they're not involved at all. And then on the other end of the continuum, we have grandparents who are like surrogate parents. They may take the children to school, they may pick them up, they may spend many days with them. Some grandparents may actually raise the grandchildren, almost like they're the parents. We call that surrogate parents. But there's a lot in between. Obviously, there are grandparents that just like to have fun with their grandchildren, and that can serve an important role. Then there's other grandchildren who might be role models, or what we call a reservoir of family wisdom, where they would pass down traditions and family values and memories in an oral tradition or through pictures, and to really let the grandchildren learn about whether it's their religious heritage or their ethnic heritage or geographic story, or stories of their parents and what they were like and the struggles they had and the hopes and dreams they've achieved or didn't achieve. So grandparents can take on a lot of different roles, some more practical, like can I help get the kids to school, versus more spiritual sources of wisdom and values and things like that.
Yeah, interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about how grandparents help to transmit those values and traditions of the family?
Sure. A lot of it depends on the parents. So if the
Mm,
parents send the message that your grandparents have a lot to offer, and that they create the time for the children to be with the grandparents, they're really sending the message that you should listen to your grandparents. They have a lot to offer you, they have a lot to share. And that really opens the ears of the grandchildren. So obviously, they need access, they need actual time spent with the grandchildren, but they also need the message from the parents that these are valuable individuals in your life, and that you should respect them, you should listen to them. They have a lot to offer you, and you can learn about your family history through them, and you can also learn a lot about the history of the world before you were born and before your parents were born.
So, as a psychologist, then, do you think that there are emotional functions that grandparents fulfill in the family that parents or siblings or other family roles may not fulfill?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great question, because grandparents are oftentimes less involved in the day to day. They can serve as benign, unconditional figures of love. And what I mean by that is that it's usually the parents who are setting the limits and who are providing the rules. And if those rules are broken, to provide the consequences for those rules. And of course, grandparents may have rules as well, but typically they don't get into the same power struggles that the grandchildren do with their own parents. So they're really a sort of reprieve for both parents and grandchildren, almost like an emotional reprieve where everyone can take a breath of relaxation to say, the grandparents are involved, the kids are going to get a little break, we get a little break from the kids, and that sort of lets the steam out of the family in a good way, emotionally speaking.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love how you sort of talk about that there might be a power struggle, but it lessens with the grandparents. I never thought of it like that, but you're so right. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
So, How might the presence of active grandparents reduce feelings of isolation within the family, particularly for the children or teenagers?
Yes, and active grandparents can, like I said in the last question, in a lot of ways, they can take the pressure off the parents as well as the grandchildren.
Yeah.
Because if a grandparents are active, the parents who are typically working and maybe busy with either other children or other activities in their own lives, they can focus on those activities a little more without leaving the kids entirely on their own. And the kids get what oftentimes is a nice break to be with their grandparents who uh, maybe have a little more disposable time because they might be retired or they might be working part time. So it's really nice because it also fills a void for the grandparents oftentimes because they may not have as many activities to do if they're retired. They time might hang a little heavy or they might not have as many friends as they once did, and so they can actually not only have the time to be with their grandchildren, but it's good for their isolation and connecting them with the next generation, as well as the grandchildren um, who the grandparents can step in and be with if the parents are working or doing different things with the other siblings.
Yeah, I never thought of it like that. I mean, our topic is definitely, the influence of grandparents on the children, on the grandchildren, and on the family. But I never thought of how the grandchildren actually influence the grandparents and have
Right,
that connection.
exactly. We say that
Yeah.
grandparents oftentimes have the gift of time, and their time is very valuable, and it's very appreciative for both the parents and the grandchildren, oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how do you think that grandparents might influence the structure or stability of a family during a major transition period or something going on, like custody arrangements or a divorce or having a guardianship, something like that?
This is a great question because when it happens, absolutely the kids can be caught in the middle. It can be very confusing for them. And when their world turns upside down due to separation or divorce or a major move or something along those lines, grandparents can be their steady constant. The grandparents may take sides, of course, but they'll be less active in the day to day. They're not actually trying to negotiate the custody arrangement or agreement, and they may not be moving houses that the parents might have to if they're in a divorce situation. So the grandparents can be this sort of almost like a lighthouse, this beacon of light that if the kids feel lost, they can go to their grandparents. They know what to expect. They're going to get about the same reaction. They're not going to be caught in the middle of anybody, usually anyway. And so the grandparents can serve a really stabilizing force in situations like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've seen some of that kind of thing happen, and it's really interesting to see like where the children can go and where the children can
Yeah.
find that stability. And definitely, yeah,
Yeah, it's a sort of
grandparents are,
safe haven. It's an emotional safe haven, and oftentimes a physical safe haven as
yeah,
well.
yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to talk a bit more about the practical application of what we've been talking about. What are some ways that families can integrate grandparents more meaningfully into their everyday life, and especially if they live far away as well?
Sure, sure. I know technology gets a bad rap in a lot of ways, but this is one area where technology can be really beneficial. And I'm thinking of just my own situation. My son plays the piano, and his grandparents are many hours away. And so, what we'll do is that we'll FaceTime, we'll put our son on the piano, and he'll get to play a few songs for his grandparents, and that's fun for them. And he gets an audience, so that's fun for him. So using technology like FaceTime or sending pictures back and forth can be very useful. We sent an electronic picture frame years ago to one of the grandparents, and so they can continually see photographs of their children, and you can update it and that sort of thing. So it's a way to stay close, even if you're far away.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that kind of thing happening in my family as well. My extended family, the electronic picture frames are so good, and you can always just upload your photos. It's
It's
really
fun.
lovely. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I
good
agree.
fun. And
It
it's
is.
great for
It
the
is.
person with the picture frame. I want one, not gonna lie, because you get to see especially if you're far away, you kind of get to see your grandchildren or your great nieces or nephews or whoever it is growing
Totally.
up and not miss
Exactly.
out on like the different stages as much. Yeah, for
Exactly.
sure. So, in terms of, I mean, we've sort of talked about the role of the parents a little bit so far, but how can grandparents positively influence a child's life without stepping on the toes of the parents or, maybe the rules that they have in place, things like that?
This is a great point, and there is this sort of the stereotype that grandparents have that you can do anything with grandma and grandpa. They'll buy you ice cream, and you can have candy, and you can do whatever you want. And the rules don't apply. And of course, in reality, that would drive parents up a wall. So what's important here are two things. One is communication, and the other is boundaries. And it's important for the grandparents to know the values of their children who are raising their grandchildren. And if there are certain things that are important to them, be that whether it's younger children like nap time and a schedule, or certain foods and staying away from ultra processed foods and sugar and things like that, or if there's medication that needs to be taken. Some of these things really should be non-negotiables, that the grandparents should hear that. Bedtime's a big one. Those are the big ones, like screen time, things like that, where if the parents feel strongly about these things, they have they really have the onus to make that clear to the grandparents, and the grandparents, I think, have the responsibility to hear them, to listen, and respect those boundaries. If it's something that's less important, then I think bending the rules and being flexible is totally appropriate. And it's not like the grandparents have to be exact carbon copies of the parents. In fact, that would be problematic in different ways. But if there are important rules, the grandparents will want to keep them in place. And that's where the boundaries are important. The parents will have to make it clear to the grandparents, and the grandparents will have to set those boundaries with their grandchildren. And if there's any discrepancies along the way, communication is key, where there's no misunderstandings, the expectations are laid out pretty clearly. And if those two features, communication and boundaries, are respected, typically it goes very, very well. And if they're not, that's where the conflict starts to arise. And that's where the parents might start to resent the grandparents. And the grandchildren feel like they're caught in between kind of these good objects of the grandparents with these harsher objects of the parents. And it's not fair to anybody involved. So that's why communication is so important.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of answered the question that I was going to ask halfway through, but when you mentioned, bending the rules, it's okay for some of the less important things. It might be a bit tricky to communicate that because the parents might think that it's really important, and the grandparents might think that something is not an important rule and just kind of leave it by the wayside, if you know what I
Yeah,
mean.
I do, and that's why communication is key. And these things can be evolving, right? Like
Mm,
the kids won't be the exact same with the grandparents as they are with the parents. So they may not need such a strict bedtime ritual or something like that, in which the grandparents could say, when they stay over at our house, we don't watch a movie, we read, and they typically go to bed right away. And, the parents could hear that and say, oh, well, they have a different routine. So let's adjust the rules a little bit. And it's not one size fits all. And every family is different, and every house is different. And so hopefully parents can allow for that sort of flexibility too.
yeah, absolutely. So earlier we were mentioning how grandparents can be a lighthouse in a time of difficulty in the family or conflict or just change generally. What do you think that grandparents can do to help create a safe environment for the grandchildren? Now, this doesn't have to be in terms of a challenging time, but it might be helpful to talk about it in that context.
Sure, sure. I think predictability is very key, that the grandchildren kind of know who's going to be in the house, more or less. There's not a lot of people coming in and out that they don't know, because that could feel unsafe. And in some cases, that is unsafe, depending on who's coming in and out. So they'll want to provide structure and predictability, that they'll be safe there. They'll be emotionally safe. They'll be physically safe. They'll have some things, if they're younger, to play with. If they're a little bit older, they'll have some activities that they can do, and that they may never play cards at home, say with their parents, but maybe they play cards with grandma or grandpa, or puzzles, or whatever it is. And I do hope it's less screen time oriented, because what we're talking about and hoping for is a real nice connection between grandparents and their grandchildren. And of course, they could always just put on the television or watch the iPad or whatever, but that's not going to provide for that connection we're looking for. So I do think predictability, safety, a schedule, those are the key aspects. And the other is, I guess, just open communication there as well. If the grandchildren have any concerns, that they can share them with the grandparents, and the grandparents will be responsive depending on the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is always key. It
Yeah,
comes back to that so often. But that's
true.
great advice. Fantastic. So, how can grandparents come to terms with and respect that they might not be the only grandparents in the child's life?
Yes, grandparent jealousy, it can be very real, and there are some grandparents who really count the hours, they count the vacation. Well, you saw them 4 times last year, you only saw us, 3 times, that sort of thing. Or the big ones are the major holidays, of course, that you might see one set of grandparents on Christmas and not the other set of grandparents, and some might be right next door, so they have access to the grandchildren all the time, and the others might live across the world. So it isn't always easy. I think the main thing to remember for parents and grandparents, those listening to this podcast specifically, would be that it's not the grandchildren's responsibility, right? It's not their fault. It's not their responsibility. They're not choosing any grandparent over the other grandparent or any set of grandparents. So it's really more of an adult problem. So the hope is that the adults can sort it out, and the adults can talk about it behind the scenes, so that grandchildren don't feel like they're bargaining chips or pawns, because it could make them feel guilty if one grandparent says, well, you saw grandma so and so more than you did. Then that might make the grandchildren feel confused or guilty, or who knows, but it's not fair. So it's a real phenomenon. I guess the challenge and hope is that the adults can be mature about it, that they can recognize that it won't always be perfectly even, and there's reasons for that, but to do the best with the time that they're given.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has all been great advice so far in our podcast, and I've loved learning from you. And we're going to take a little break to talk about the worst case scenario. Now, this is where I would love it if you could outline a tricky scenario or a worst possible outcome of what we've been talking about so far, perhaps of grandparenting or something to do with the relationships, and how we might get ourselves into this situation and how we might manage it.
Sure, sure. I can think of a couple worst case scenarios, some being worse than others, of
Yeah.
course. The worst case scenario that might come up would be um, if unfortunately there were a tragedy, say that the parents were incapacitated or even killed. The question would be whether the grandparents would step in and um, serve as the surrogate parents at that point. And really, all of that hopefully is talked about in advance in estate planning and things like that, so that the grandparents, and if there's aunts or uncles, that it's crystal clear that what the wishes of the parents would have been. So that's one worst case scenario that could be avoided by planning, by considering the future, by having it clearly dictated in a last will and testament, for instance, that sort of thing. One step back from that, a less worst case scenario would be if there's major differences between how thinking about value systems or spiritual beliefs or just day to day. It could be politics, it could be day to day functioning, where there's a major discrepancy between the grandparents and the parents. And one that I've seen would be, say, the grandparents just sort of making this up, but this sort of was a case with a family I worked with as well. That they may live in a more rural setting where there's more dangers with regard to, say, there's guns at the property or something like that, whereas the parents may not have guns at the property. And so it's important to really consider these different value shifts, the safety features, things like that, so that all parties feel comfortable with what's happening. And then what can happen is if the grandparents don't respect the parents' values and wishes, then there can be a sort of estrangement where the parents may say, well, if you don't change your rules, like get rid of the guns or believe these things or eat a certain way or have these certain values. And I'm not saying either side is right or wrong in this instance. It all depends on your own personal beliefs. But if there is a discrepancy, then that can lead to conflict. And that could lead to the parents saying, okay, well, we're not going to bring our we're not going to bring our children over. You're not going to see your grandchildren anymore. And, that's hard for the grandchildren because they won't necessarily understand it. It'll be hard for the grandparents. In the only instance where I would really, really strongly recommend that as a mental health professional is that if for whatever reason, um, the grandparents' situation was not stable or safe due to mental illness or lack of safety precautions, things like that, then I would advise that that's probably not a safe environment for your grandchildren to go to. And if you do, you'll want to be there to supervise it very heavily, that sort of thing. But short of that, sometimes there's just kind of different political beliefs that they might not believe the same things. And that happens, of course, in the United States, especially, or although around the world. And um, hopefully, parents and grandparents, if it's not going to negatively impact the children, can put those differences aside. That's sort of a worst case scenario that could be resolved through, I hope, communication and maturity. But sometimes it gets difficult, and the parents might say, well, you always have, say, this station on or that station on, and I don't want my kids to listen to those stations. And if the grandparents say, well, we're not turning off the TV, so we're not going to be flexible in that way, then there's this kind of worst case scenario of, well, what do we do? That I guess we're not going to bring the grandchildren over. But the hope would be that parents and grandchildren could meet in the middle and find some sort of a way to not have the grandchildren be this sort of pawn in a value system or lifestyle disagreement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I never thought of that sort of third party influence of the media, like something on the TV being a problem, but obviously it
Yeah.
could be. And I
I
suppose,
yeah.
yeah.
I actually hear that a lot. There's certain
Wow.
stations that one political party, won't listen to, or one
Yeah.
that the other will listen to, that sort of thing. And there's I won't name stations, but you can imagine. And so what happens is some parents or grandchildren or grandparents would have this on all the time, and the grandchildren hear it, and that could influence their belief system, which is unacceptable to a lot of parents. So, yeah, the media can unfortunately get involved in a sort of power struggle between the parents and the grandparents.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose the solution would be to like meet up outside of the house,
Yeah,
right?
great. That's a great point. Yeah,
But
absolutely.
there's also then the issues of, what radio are we playing in the car or like that
You
kind of
got
thing.
it.
It's
You
so
got it.
that's
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It comes up more than you'd think, actually.
Yeah. I totally hadn't thought of that, but now that you say it, it seems so obvious because grandparents or parents, whoever, they always have the TV on. They always have the
They
radio on in
do.
the car.
Yeah,
It's pretty
lot of families do. That's
it's
right.
it's pretty consistent, at least in my family. Like you're always gonna be having something on in the background, even if you're not really watching it. But it
Totally.
influences you for
It
sure.
it does. It does. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
choices of movies and things like the choices of show.
Sure, yeah.
If the grandparents are watching, violent shows about crime and forensic investigations, that that can be pretty scary and confusing for the kids, grandkids,
Mm.
especially if they've never been exposed to that sort of thing.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't think of that either. My family's pretty tame. I mean, we love a murder mystery, but
Right, right.
other than that, yeah, that's so interesting. So I'd like to move on now to our practices and habits segment. This is
Sure.
where I just want to ask you, is there a habit that you'd recommend grandparents practicing in order to be a better grandparent?
Sure, sure. And, really, I think it comes down to listening. And it seems simple, but it's harder to do than you might think. But grandparents might have an idea of what activity they think they want to do with their grandchildren. And that's okay. But what they'll really want to do is to step back and listen to what their grandchildren are talking about. Listen to what they're interested in. And if they're less verbal because they're younger, then just watching to see what the grandkids gravitate to, and then learning from that, and then asking questions, being curious about these activities, and then follow their grandchildren's lead. And you can certainly play fun activities. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but you just want to follow the lead of the grandchildren. That would be something I would recommend. And so it's listening, it's watching, it's being curious, asking questions, and then following the grandchildren's lead. That can make a real difference in a relationship.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can imagine it would create a better connection with the grandchild as well because they're getting to do what they love with somebody that they love, and it just makes that connection stronger instead of being forced to do something that they're not really interested in
Exactly.
doing and having a
Exactly.
bad experience.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
interesting. Is there any, time or any people that you wouldn't suggest doing this or any situation where it wouldn't work out?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, I guess
Mm,
if the grandchildren were really active and they wanted to play football or something like that, and the
yeah,
grandparents maybe were older, then they wouldn't be able to jump in and throw the football around
yeah,
necessarily, and so that wouldn't work. But they could get creative, and um, they could, if there's two siblings, they could watch, or they could encourage from the sideline, that sort of thing. And so that'd be one area where it wouldn't necessarily work. The other would be, depending on the environment, if, say, the grandparents live in an apartment or something like that, and the grandkids are really active. It'd be sort of hard to be too active. I mean, hopefully they could go out to the park or something like that. But that's where you might challenge the grandchildren to, well, have you ever thought about doing a puzzle or trying to cook something? Or so this would be where it would be on the grandparents to get creative and to, in this case, not necessarily follow the lead of the grandchildren, but to throw some activities out there to see if anything sticks. And you never know, maybe the grandchildren would get into cooking a little bit with the grandparents. And so they could expand their world a little bit as well. So in that case, it'd be sort of a flip where it'd be less watching and listening. You could try that, but if for whatever reason the environment didn't permit it, you might try to, in a good way, engage the grandchildren to think a little differently and try different activities. And instead of forcing the activity on them, it's just sort of offering it up and saying, why don't you try cooking with grandma, or why don't we do a puzzle or play cards together or a board game or whatever it might be. And every now and then that's super successful. And then it expands the grandchildren's world quite a bit. And they might find themselves being interested in something they never thought they'd be interested in. And that's awesome.
yeah. It definitely helps to have, in my opinion, an activity that you often do with your grandparents that's maybe a bit different from usual or different from what you do at home with your parents because it creates a different relationship and something that's more
Absolutely.
connected. Yeah.
I agree completely. And I think that makes it all the more special.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to our open mic. This is your chance to talk about anything you're passionate about. It doesn't really have to be related to the topic if you don't want to, but it can be, of course. So the floor is yours.
Sure, sure. Well, so I write a fair amount through Psychology Today and different. You've got a couple books going, and so the the idea of we're kind of in flux right now with regard to parenting and grandparenting for that matter. So it is an open mic on the same topic, but hopefully through a different lens a little bit. And one of the articles I wrote about is. I forget the exact title, but it was something like "Let your children be bored; they'll thank you for it later." And so this is where I really think we can learn as a society. I think we want our kids to, this is something we learned through the pandemic, that being outside and having activities outside can be a really, really good thing. So I'm super pro nature with regard to parenting and just in general. I think just being outside, there's a lot of research around bluescapes and greenscapes. So bluescapes would just be anything with water. Greenscapes would be anything with trees or grass or nature in general. The idea is it lowers your blood pressure, it's calming, it's just very healthy to be outside. I think some countries do this better than others. I think in Australia, you guys get out quite a bit and do a lot outside. And I think that's awesome. And we can learn a lot from cultures like that, certainly in the United States or other places in the world where maybe we're more urban or we don't get outside as much, or our learning models are, sit in a classroom and learn things from a computer screen or from a book or whatever. I mean, there's could be a place for that, but I think, hands-on learning, getting dirty out in nature, running around and splashing in ponds and mud and being around animals. I mean, I'm really a proponent of all that. I think it can be very healthy, and it's certainly very good for mental health, but it can also promote learning and curiosity and active play, and a lot of different forms of intelligence can be enhanced through just getting outside. So, this would be looking at our school system. It'd be looking at school systems throughout the world, as well as how they spend their time, whether it's on the screen or whether it's outside, how we parent, how we grandparent, just really emphasizing less structured activities, downtime, forcing kids to come up with creative games on their own because there isn't a video game or a tablet telling them what to do, or for that matter, a teacher or a parent forcing them to come up with games on their own and to role play and to really use their imagination in ways that unfortunately I think we've gotten away from in a society. I'm also a big proponent of waiting to have electronics. My son's in high school and he doesn't have a cell phone. Now, the good news is he doesn't want one, so it's not like we're depriving him of the cell phone. I like to think it's because we've raised him in a way that he has a lot of interests, and most of those are off the screen. Now, he does use the computer and he plays video games, and he's a very normal kid in a lot of ways, but he's also out riding his bike a lot and playing with his kids and playing with the neighbors and walking around the neighborhood and doing things like that. So, this is sort of my viewpoint regarding setting limits with screens, getting outside, looking at our educational systems to make sure they integrate free play and cooperative interaction and hands-on learning and all these things that unfortunately I think we've gotten away from in a lot of our school systems.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love what you said about, different cultures getting outside differently, and how in Australia maybe we do it better. And I started thinking about how, well, the weather is better in some places. So
Right, right,
maybe we
right.
do get out more. But at the same time, if it's cold, we're not acclimatized to it being cold. So there's no way we're going out.
Oh,
I
that's
saw,
fair.
yeah, I saw on TV the other day a group of school kids in the UK where it was obviously freezing cold, all out in their coats and boots and hats and scarves. And I was like, I would just stay inside.
Right, right, right.
But they
Yeah.
were obviously, going on an excursion and they have to go on whatever day. And of course, it's going to be cold because it's very often cold there. So
It's a good point, and it's
so
in the
interesting.
Scandinavian countries are often found to be
Oh,
some of the happiest in the world,
of
and it
course.
gets cold up there, and yet they're
Yeah.
like, well, we go out anyway, and we have winter festivals, and we
Yeah.
embrace winter sports, and it's really a part of their culture, and I think it works.
Yeah.
And in Finland, they're doing the saunas many times a week and that sort of thing, and the
Yeah.
culture is built around being outside. and being active. And I think we could all learn a lot from cultures like that.
Absolutely. I mean, they have to, right? In Scandinavian countries, it's always cold, or like if you live in an island up near the North Pole or something like that,
Sure.
what choice do you have? I mean, they have cultures that are built around, creating the clothing that is perfect for that weather and all sorts of
Absolutely.
things. It's really
Absolutely.
interesting.
It
And I
is.
also
Yeah.
think what you said about like getting out and being active is really interesting because some cultures have more of a sporting focus than others. And like, so here, for example, we have a lot of people and a lot of kids that are out playing like Australian rules football all the
Uh-huh.
time. And that's great. And that is across the winter season. And then in Europe, you've got, what I would call soccer is
Right.
huge and it's not as huge here and that kind of thing. So I think
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
an interesting difference between the cultures as well, for sure.
Absolutely. It
So
absolutely is.
anyway, I am going to have to conclude this episode soon, unfortunately, and I have learnt so much from you. Can I ask if our listeners want to find out more about you and your work, where can they go?
Sure, sure. So I do have a website, which is www.decadeofchildhood.com. And so that there's a blog on there, and also it'll preview some of the books that I'm working on right now. And I also do have Instagram. It would be Dr. Kurt Ela dot. Well, yeah. So,
Yeah.
at Dr. Kurt Ela,
Yeah.
DrKurtEla. And I try to do informative reels on there about parenting, about grandparenting, about mental health just in general. And so I think it's a good place to get information around mental health just in general.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I'll definitely put a link to your website and your Instagram in our show notes and make sure that people can find you and any resources there so it's easy for them. So thank you so much for tuning in. I have certainly learnt a lot from Kurt today and I hope that our listeners have as well. So thank you for joining us.
Of course.
And we will catch our audience in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent. Thanks for tuning in.